Good morning, everyone. Richard Vedder back again for another podcast with you. We're going to talk about four things today, but before I even tell you let's discuss what those four things are because we have two great guests, and I want to before I do anything, I want to introduce George Leaf, the research director of the James Martin Center, who is with us. George, good
Good
morning.
morning, Rich.
Great. And we have uh, uh, second and not the least, but because he's second on my screen, it's the next one. Andrew Gillen. Andrew is this is strange. Andrew is with the higher ed research guru at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And where would someone working at the Texas Public Policy Foundation live? Naturally, in Florida, of course. So he lives in Venice. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Okay, great. Before we start the topics that I really want to talk about today, that I told our guests that we talk about are the old perennial or recent perennial student loan forgiveness, which there's so much that we can say about it, and we will, but that's obviously a topic of great interest today. Uh, the second is there's been efforts very recently by the Biden administration to roll back reforms to Title IX regulations that reforms that came about in the Trump administration under Betsy DeVos that have been rolled back by the Biden administration. We might want to talk about that for a bit. Uh, there is a new study out by Times Higher Ed, an international rankings of university study that shows very strong evidence that the U.S. is declining and declining rapidly in research distinction internationally, that the U.S. is really in a decline. And I will we'll chat about that for a minute. And then the old perennial, FAFSA, the federal, what is it? Andrew, what is it? Federal aid
The
to,
free application for federal student aid.
thank you, Andrew. Uh, this form, hated form, which goes well over 100 questions, has Congress mandated by law a couple years ago, a year or so ago, that it be simplified. And it turns out that's not going to happen anytime real soon. By the way, this has been going on 15 years that I know about. And so we'll chat briefly about that. Why in the heck? Oh, what the hell? We're on TV. Why? Or we can say anything we want. Why the hell don't why doesn't the government, as inept as it is, why can't it at least come up with a form that is different? And maybe we don't need the form at all. We'll talk about that. All right. So before I call on George and Andrew on the big topics that I just mentioned, I want to tell you about a news item that I read about just 2 or 3 hours ago. The MacArthur Foundation, the John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation, gives out each year awards which are nicknamed Genius Grants. This year they're $800,000 a piece. They're giving this year 25 of these awards out. That is to say, they're handing $20 million out pretty much unrestricted to 25 individuals to use any way they want, as long as it has some quasi academic, cultural, artistic purpose to it. Uh, and they've been doing this for years and years. What's interesting about this award to me is that if you are a white male, you need not apply. That's not quite true. Incidentally, you can't apply for these awards. They're not open for application. They're just made by a committee in some interesting and somewhat secret way. We don't know. But this year, out of the 25 awards, two of them went to white males, 8%. And you say, oh, that's maybe a fluke. The same thing happened last year. I don't recall from memory what the exact numbers were last year, but when I saw the pictures of the people last year, I said, that's interesting. There are no men in it. Then I said, not only that, where there are a few men, they're not white. And this sounds like a racist statement, maybe by me. I would be accused of that, of course. But when white males make up what, 40, 50, 60% of the scientific and cultural communities from which awards like this are made, the pool is 40, 50, 60, maybe even in the sciences, maybe 70% white male, 60%, 50%, 40%, 30% at least, 20%. Why can't they why is the number of white males so few? And that, I would like to say, that's just indicative of a broader picture within higher ed. There is a war against males, particularly white males, because males are bad people, women are good people, whites are bad people, non-whites are good people. And I'm overstating it, I know a bit, but that's it. So then I said, well, let's look at male, besides the race, let's look at male, female. The females outnumbered the males substantially in that 25, 15 to 10. That isn't quite as outrageously out of proportion or from what you would expect. And last year was similar, but it is even that you could argue we are in a society that is anti-white, maybe. It's racist oriented. Everything is based on, are you the right color? Are you the right race? And so on. So this is, a lot of people feel this, and I sense some of this in Arthur Ward. So I asked the question, well, let me talk about the other indignity I read about this morning. The other thing that struck me. I read this on, I don't know where, Inside Higher Ed or somewhere. The average ACT score, new data out on the average ACT score for the class of 2022, high school graduating class of 2022, applying for college. The aggregate average ACT score was 19.8. This is the first time since 1991, the first time in this century where the number was below 20. The first time. It was the lowest number in over 30 years. And of course, the pandemic plays a very significant role in this. But one might argue that it doesn't play the entire role. That's something we can talk about. Moreover, 42% of the students taking the ACT fail to meet what the ACT judges' minimal preparatory standards in any one of the 4 subject matters surveyed: English, reading, science, or math. 42% of the students were below what ACT views as minimal preparatory preparation in those subjects. And this 42% were unprepared in all 4 of those subjects, not in just one, in all 4. So 2 out of 5 Americans taking the ACT, if you believe ACT, are utterly, maybe the word utterly unprepared for college may be the wrong word, but it's the way I interpret it. Now, so I started out today in a cantankerous mood before I even got out of bed, because I was reading this in bed. I had watched the morning news, which was depressing enough. I said, "Oh, I read the morning news. Let's go somewhere else and look at the news, and I came on these two items. So I am deeply depressed, and it is only 10:10 in the morning in the East, and it is altogether too early to start drinking. And so I am going to hold off until at least noon before I have my first alcoholic beverage. Okay, enough of that. By the way, George or Andrew, at this point, I've ranted and raved long enough. Do either of you have any comments you want to make?
Sure. I'd like to say something about the ACT scores. It's
Okay.
exactly what you would expect, because public education, in fact, we might go even further and say schooling, because this has infected private schools too,
Sure.
has been on a dumbing down trend for decades. Quite a few years ago, Heather McDonald wrote a really fine piece entitled Anything But Knowledge. She was talking about the trend. I think this was published in 1998, by the way. The trends in teacher education. And teachers were really not supposed to focus on knowledge. That was too oppressive. Sage on the stage. Kids should discover their own knowledge and shouldn't have it imparted to them at school. So for more than 25 years now, we've been on this path of teachers who are, first of all, themselves less and less competent in any academic subject, imbued with this idea that, well, you should just let kids discover their own knowledge. We now even get to the point where they're saying, it's just kind of racist to insist on correct answers. That's an evidence of white hegemony to say that there's kids should come up with the right answer on their math problems or their physics problems. That's oppressive. So this is seeping down into the schools. Kids are getting less and less real instruction in things that count on the ACT, the ability to read and write English, the ability to do some basic mathematics. They're less and less good at that because their teachers just don't focus on it much anymore.
Yeah, that's the way I think. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that? You don't have to.
I think that's definitely a definite concerning trend that's been ongoing for a long time. The more hopefully temporary partial explanation might be COVID. So depending on where you went to school, you could have been stuck on Zoom school for a couple years. And Zoom school done well can still be good, but a lot of times it's not. And so we could have seen a pretty substantial decline in actually the quality of education that was delivered, regardless of kind of these long-term trends. Fortunately, we'll know how much of this was COVID related in a couple years once that's not an issue anymore. So yeah, I think there's definitely a long-term trend, but I think there might also be this temporary disturbance as well.
Picking up on George's point, I once testified before the Ohio legislature that I would make it a criminal offense for a superintendent of schools or a principal to knowingly hire a graduate of a college of education. And it got a lot of laughs, but I was being somewhat serious about it. I'm not sure about throwing principals in jail over it, but at least there ought to be lose their license over it. By the way, that's another topic for another day, but teacher licensure is another scandal worth going into.
Yep.
And licensure at the college level often means just getting a PhD. It's an informal form of licensure. Is the PhD really the appropriate credential to teach? That would be another topic for another day, but it's one we might want to talk about someday. Do you think maybe we ought to get into the topics that I promised you that we would talk about, rather than the topics that I happened to read about this morning? Let's start with federal student loan forgiveness. Now, we've heard there's been infinite quantities of stuff written about this in the last month or two or three or four. And we probably ought to review briefly what the arguments are for and against a student loan forgiveness program. And I think the three of us are, should we say, profoundly skeptical of the efficacy of these programs. But I have argued recently, to just start the discussion, that it's kind of dumb politically. Biden, I think, was assuming that there's this massive 40 million people who have student loans outstanding, and if we forgive $10,000 or $20,000 of the loans, and by the way, Andrew will point this out more than anyone, but I'm familiar with them too. Some of the hidden provisions in this thing suggests that the total amount being forgiven is far greater than that, with this 5% limit on what you have to repay and so on. It's sort of a disguised understatement of what is being forgiven. But whatever the amount is, it's huge. It's hundreds of billions. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I think the CBO, not a far right organization by any means, Congressional Budget Office, announced that the deficit increase associated with this is immediate deficit increases in excess of $400 billion. They raised the estimate of the federal, and they made them add that $400 billion into the fiscal 2022 budget to show that the deficit was $1.4 trillion last year. Another subject again for another day, but 30% of that 1.4 trillion was this forgiveness program. 30% of that debt. So let's ask the question: why is this a bad program? How costly is it? What are some of the administrative problems? Can the Biden administration, who can't even simplify the FAFSA form can they in 30 days or 60 days assure these 40 million people that they will indeed get relief or not? You got to apply, or do you have to apply? All these sort of administrative decisions. Is it a political win for the Democrats? As I started saying, I think a lot of people will say, I didn't go to college and I didn't get any help. I make 50,000 a year. There are people who are making 100,000 a year who are getting much more, are getting this relief, and I'm not getting anything. They just want to help the elite snobs who went to college or whatever. Is it a political win for the Democrats? And the ultimate question is, are there better ways of financing higher education than a federal student loan program? So that's a whole bunch of questions. Why is it, Andrew, I'm going to start with Andrew this time. Why is the student loan forgiveness program bad, or is it bad? Maybe I guess I'm starting out with a bias of my own there. What are the problems with a federal student loan?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a ton of problems with student loan forgiveness in general, and also with this particular plan for forgiveness. So we recently put out a report with it lists 18 different kind of problems with student loan forgiveness. The ones that I think are most important are sort of the mistargeting. So if you look at loan repayment, there's maybe 5% that just are not going to be able to repay for whatever reason. They're permanently disabled, or they got a degree that's totally worthless, and they have no real labor market prospects. There's another 5 to 10% that will struggle with their debt, but can pay something. And so any sort of reasonable public policy would limit the assistance that you're providing to this 5 to 15% of students. That's not what this did. So Biden's plan provides forgiveness to 95% of students, not 15. So the mistargeting of this is just absolutely ridiculous. You're basically taking the poster child of a college dropout who still has student loan debt and is working a minimum wage job, can't afford that, and you're using that as an excuse to give up to $40,000 to a couple that's making up to $250,000 a year. Like this is a complete kind of bait and switch in that regard. Another big problem that I have with it is there's better solutions. So Australia, the UK, and even the US, we've been slowly moving in this direction of these income contingent, income driven repayment programs, where your monthly payment is not a function of how much you borrow; it's a function of how much you earn. And so if you borrow more, you're going to repay for longer. If you borrow less, you'll pay it off shorter. But like by making your repayment a function of your income, payments are always affordable. And so this completely solves the unaffordable debt problem, because if your income goes down, so does your student loan payment. And so this is a great solution to kind of the existing student loan repayment issues that we've seen, and we've already been doing it. And instead of just kind of fixing that and encouraging students to enroll in those programs and maybe make them the default, we're instead kind of forgiving that at the back end. In terms of long-term programs or long-term problems, I think the most dangerous ones are really the effect this will have on the education. So if you think about what this does to students' incentives to borrow, all of a sudden, all students are going to start borrowing as much as they can, because they're going to expect future rounds of forgiveness. At the same time, what are colleges going to do? College now have an incentive to raise their tuition because they can always say to the student, "Hey, don't worry, you're not going to have to pay it anyway. There's going to be more loan forgiveness the next election." So I think this is going to completely break the way higher education has been financed historically, which I have no objection to. I have a lot of problems with the way we finance higher education, but this is not going to break it in a good way. This is gonna break it in a very, very bad way by essentially encouraging schools to raise tuition and encouraging students to borrow more. So I could go on and on. I think I've only mentioned 4 of the 18 problems.
You hit some of the
to weigh in here as well.
You hit some of the big ones, Andrew. George, you're a lawyer, actually. It just occurred to me. Is there legal problems with the whole thing?
There certainly are. There's going to be litigation. Cases have already been filed arguing that the president has no authority to do what he's doing. And I don't think those cases even go far enough. The right question to ask is, does the president have any authority, not under some arcane statute, the HEROES Act, does the president have any authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to willy-nilly say, well, these debts, money that is owed to the U.S. Treasury, I am now forgiving? There's nothing in the Constitution that even hints at such a power. The people who drafted the Constitution would have seen that as an open invitation to cronyism, to favoritism, to say, well, you're supporters of mine, you're friends of mine, you owe the government money, but I'm going to decree that you don't have to pay it back. That, I think, really is the core constitutional problem. There is no federal authority for the government, the president, to do what he's purporting to do here. Now, it may be stopped on other grounds, but I think that is the real ground that should be stopped on. The president cannot just waive money that is owed to the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah. Now, what does this do? I think you both are raising tremendously important issues here. It's illegal. It's wrong. It's stupid. I mean, that covers pretty much everything. It seems there's not a hell of a lot.
Policy trifecta.
And not only that, I started arguing, I finished the argument. I think it's politically stupid because you're making so many non-college grads. They're okay. Maybe you're helping some 40 million people. A portion of those 40 million people, a large portion of those 40 million, are getting some relief they wouldn't have otherwise. Some of them I've talked to who are getting checks saying it's wrong. I don't deserve this check. Why am I getting it? In fact, I'm not sure I'm even going to apply for it. Then they say, yeah, $10,000 is $10,000. I think I will apply for it. I would, I guess. But what about, don't you think there are an awful lot of people who even went to college and paid off their debts that are going to be annoyed as hell at seeing others who, they scrimped, they saved, they didn't take fancy vacations in the summer, they didn't buy nice cars, they didn't go on cruises because they had to pay off their student loan. Whereas their friends, some of them took the cruises and the nice vacations and bought the nice cars and didn't pay their debt. We're giving money to the less responsible, fiscally responsible people, and we're punishing, in effect, those who were responsible. What kind of lesson is that? So anyway, I'm pretty upset about it.
Well, I think you should be, Rich, and I agree with you that this is not the political winner that Biden probably expected it would be. It's coming to people's attention that the big winners in this are people who have expensive professional degrees, a lot of lawyers, for example, who piled up a lot of student loans to go to fancy elite law schools and now have high-paying jobs with which they could pay their loans back, but now they don't have to. That's going to make a lot of people very upset. We oftentimes hear complaints about some program having disparate impact. Well, this has a lot of disparate impact. It has a disparate impact in helping the rich. That's not going to play well in Peoria, as the expression goes.
Well, and you can see this in the campaigns that are going on right now. The Democrats that are in kind of swing states and swing districts, they're not trumpeting this as a Biden policy that they support, which tells you how this plays out politically, at least in those states and districts.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Andrew's point is well taken, because AOC and her friends, the squad, are by and large cool on this, as Andrew said. And so if you annoy the left within the Democratic Party, as well as the right, as well as middle-class Americans, I don't know that's a big winner. So I guess time will tell. We got an election coming up pretty soon. So anyway, I wonder if the Democratic Party has made a big mistake here. How important is this in the broader election picture? We'll let the politicians and the pundits say. By the way, do you people share my concern about this election? I mean, in a broader sense, if the Senate and were to be retained entirely by the Democrats, do you think we are going to be in for this? Wasn't on the agenda at all. Do you see? I worry about really going ahead with things like ending the filibuster in the Senate, admitting DC as a state to the Union, a whole variety of things which would dramatically change the tenor of American politics. Is that really a threat?
I'm concerned as well, Rich. Chuck Schumer, for example, has been chattering away about all the things they'd love to do if they could just have enough in the Senate, so they didn't have to rely upon Manchin and Sinema out in Arizona. If they could get another seat or two, and there are some shaky Republican seats that could go. If they had that power, they'd use it. They wouldn't hesitate. They know that they're on thin ice, and so they'll do everything they can to cement their power right now.
here's my political take on this whole specific issue of forgiveness. I believe higher education is a ward of the state. Higher ed depends utterly on government. And that's not just public higher ed, the so-called state universities. I once did an analysis of Princeton University, which has $3 million of endowment almost per student. Princeton University, if it spent 4% annually out of its endowment, which would be a very low percentage, would be spending $120,000 per student just there without any tuition fees, any government grants and all. Princeton University doesn't need a dime of student tuition money, doesn't need a dime. Next door to Princeton, according to Google Maps, about a 20-minute drive away, is a school that used to be called Trenton State University, now going by the much more Tony name of the College of New Jersey, ironically, the original name of Princeton University. So here are these two schools, a dozen miles apart, 20 minutes apart. Which one gets more government money? Not lowly little College of New Jersey, but the uppity Princeton, who really needs those dollars badly. They get lots of money. You donate a building to Princeton, you get a deduction on your income tax as an individual. The subsidy comes in directly through the donors. The donors get money. We're going to help those poor people who want to build Whitman College at Princeton, which cost $130,000. $300,000, I think, $300,000 a dorm room to build. I mean, it costs more per dorm room to build than any Trump resort. So here we're building Trump resorts in Princeton, New Jersey, for rich upper class kids, all subsidized by the federal government. Because Meg Whitman went to Princeton, I guess. I assume that's why. So I find, that if I were a lefty, which I'm not, I would be raising hell about this. We're giving the rich. This is a subsidy to the rich, but more generally, it's a higher ed. It's a subsidy to higher ed, and the federal government and the state governments as well subsidize higher ed. Maybe it's justified on positive spillover effect, as we say in economics, externality grounds. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But certainly that's why they're doing it. I mean, they want to keep the constituents happy. Yeah. Our constituents are higher ed. They're the ones that write checks to us. They're the ones who hold office. Of the 20, I did a study this once, the original members of the Biden cabinet, almost all of them were graduates of college universities. And so, and many of them of elite universities, and some of them were professors.
Uh-oh. did we lose Rich?
Yeah,
well, I have a brief.
I annoyed the hell out of someone. They took me off the screen.
I've got a brief comment. Rich, you're absolutely right. The left wingers back in the 60s and 70s would have been apoplectic about funding the plutocratic universities. But now that they run the plutocratic universities, they don't care.
Yeah, even more than don't care.
They love it.
Hey, they love it. Yeah. Our friends, at Harvard, they need our support. And so on and so forth. Even, by the way, I read an article last night that suggests that the economists at the Federal Reserve System, it was an analysis of the political affiliations of economists working at the various Federal Reserve banks, the 12 Federal Reserve banks. This was in the Independent Review, this last issue, and they're for every Republican registrant, there are 10 Democrats. Pretty much what you see in academics.
Yeah.
I once met a sociologist at Princeton, by the way, who told me he was a Republican, and I asked for his autograph. Who ever heard of a Republican sociologist, particularly in a place like Princeton? A first-rate sociologist, by the way, an expert on migration, which was a field I was studying at the time. So anyway, so we've made a blunder here. I wonder how much it's going to cost the administration. Well, I guess 3 weeks, 4 weeks from now, we'll know. Maybe. Either one of you have any predictions about the election results, by the way, at this stage? This is not a program dedicated to that topic, and none of us are experts on the topic, but we all have a sense. We are all public citizens. We all read. George, do you have any sense?
No, I don't. It's all very murky, very scary. The left has thrown a fantastic amount of money into these campaigns, using every tactic, deception, and I'm sure there'll also be a great deal of fraud in these elections. They've been practicing this for a long time. They've become rather good at it. Lots of dead people are going to be voting, and they'll all be voting one way. I'm quite sure of that. So I'm not going to make any predictions.
Okay. Well,
I think
you're
too
smart.
dicey.
You're smart, Andrew.
I mean, I just defer to 538. So right now they're projecting about a 1/3 chance of Republicans taking the Senate and about a 2/3 chance of Republicans taking the House. But both of those are trending up for the past week or so, which is
trending.
And I just saw the
trending up for who? For the Republicans? Trending up for who? The Republicans?
For the Republicans, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I have a sense that things are moving a little bit up for the Republicans.
Yeah, and the inflation numbers out today are not pretty. That's not going to help Democrats either.
What are give it?
So the core inflation is actually the highest it's been, I think, in something like 40 years, something like that. So the headline inflation rate dropped a little bit, but core inflation, which takes out food and energy, which are really volatile, is still trending up, which means that whatever the Fed and the Biden administration have been doing to fight inflation has not yet worked.
Yeah. Well, by the way, a subject for another day are things like the measurement of inflation, what is the appropriate measure, etc. But it's terrible. You know, damn it, I wasn't going to talk about this, but it annoys the hell out of me that even my field of economics, intelligent people forget basic realities that we used to teach in principles of economics 25 years ago. If you drop money out of airplanes over a community, people are going to get these pieces of paper. They're going to run to the store and try to buy things. Soon it's going to take more of these pieces of paper to buy any given item because the demand for goods will be rising faster than the supply, to put it in sort of crude terms, and prices will go up. The equation of exchange. And this is just elementary stuff we taught. I shouldn't. Andrew, you were in my class, weren't you? You were for me, Andrew. Damn it! This is outrageous. This is simply outrageous. And yet, in the year 2020, the money supply, and we can argue about definition, M1, M2. There have been changes in the uses of monetary aggregates. We got Bitcoin. We got a whole bunch of things that impact the world these days. But the basic money supply, any definition you use, 15, 20% annual increases. You increase the money supply 20% in a year where output is not growing. in fact, indeed, output is falling because of the pandemic, you're going to get some inflationary impact. There's a lag. And sure enough, there was a lag of a year or so before it really impacted. So is it shocking that we're getting big inflation? On the fiscal policy side, is it shocking when you run a deficit that is 10, 15% of the gross domestic product? When you get to Greek levels, Argentinian levels of deficits, is it shocking that you get inflationary effects? I don't think so.
So I think two things happened that really left us unprepared for the current bout of inflation that we're having. So the first was kind of like the defanging of Republicans from the Great Recession. So if you remember back to the Great Recession, so it was like 2008 through whenever you want to put the end date. A lot of Republicans were predicting pretty high inflation because of the Fed's new programs like quantitative easing. That inflation didn't happen. And so what that essentially did was it gave permission to a lot of people to ignore Republicans when they complain or when they warn about inflation. The other thing that I think happened was that Democrats, at least a sizable contingent of them, got taken in with what's called modern monetary theory. And this is, I mean, we don't need to get into all the details of it, but basically, it's an excuse for politicians to spend as much money as they want on whatever they want. That's what politicians hear when this theory is described, and of course that appeals to them. and so you had kind of the inflation hawks and the Republicans who had been sort of ignored, discredited. And you had a sizable wing of the Democrats that bought into this modern monetary theory, and as a result, you had something that in any of our textbooks, if you have this much massive fiscal stimulus, when an economy is already at productive capacity, there's nowhere for it to go but inflation, and so this was predicted by a lot of people, including a lot of people on the left. Larry Summers was doing really great work pointing this out before the problem occurred. And so yeah, the inflation mess that we're in is completely foreseeable, completely dependent on the bad policies of the Biden administration. And now the Fed is going to be forced to potentially put the economy into recession to end this inflation.
Yeah, I completely agree. By the way, I testified before Congress in 2008 after the election, right before Obama took office, about the stimulus package that Obama was proposing for $800 billion roughly. And the new head of the Council of Economic Advisors coming in, Christina Romer, said, the unemployment rate will not go above 8%. Will not go above 8%. A very explicit prediction. The stimulus package passed. It passed easily. Larry Summers said it in the testimony. I was testifying. Larry Summers was testifying. Robert Rubin was testifying, and Alan Blinder was testifying. We were the four witnesses. I was appointed by the Republicans. The others were appointed by the Democrats. There was a senator there who came up afterwards and told me, Mr. Vedder, you're a nice guy from Appalachia, but you don't know what the hell you're talking about. That senator was Chuck Schumer. So in 2008, after Blinder testified, after Rubin testified, and especially after Summers testified, predicting that we won't have much of a downturn at all because we're going to stimulate the hell out of the economy. We passed almost exactly what was being proposed. The unemployment rate went not only above 8%, it did so for 43 consecutive months, the longest period of that type of unemployment since the Great Depression. So that's just a little historic note of my own on this topic. And I'm rather proud of my disagreement with Larry Summers, but I agree exactly with Andrew. I've been jumping up and down for joy for Larry Summers. He's a voice of reason these days. And when I think of Larry Summers as the voice of reason, reason has gone to hell in this country. So anyway,
the world turned upside down.
It has indeed. Well, we've been talking. We have a lot more we could say about the student loan programs, and maybe we should say a little more. Let me throw out the ultimate question. Why do we have a federal student loan program? If we didn't have a federal student loan program, would our nation be okay? Would life go on? Do too many kids go to college anyway? Maybe we should deter kids from going to college. Maybe we should tax kids. Maybe we should have a tax, sales taxes by the states on tuition fees, because students are no longer an asset to our society. They're a liability. They have negative spillover effects. They go to college, they get brainwashed by these crazy professors, and then they go out and want to start revolutions. They want to dishonor the American tradition. They want to destroy the First Amendment to the Constitution, to pick just one thing, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we ought to tax rather than subsidize the universities. But if you believe we ought to subsidize them, we have to do it through student loans. Is there a better way to do it?
Well, if I could jump in on that question first, Rich. The United States did very, very well for itself from 1776 through about 1965 with no federal aid programs. It was only when Lyndon Johnson had complete power, and he used it to pass the Higher Education Act of 1965, and that got us started down this road of ever-increasing government financing for kids who want to go to college. That led to a vast increase in the number who went to college, simultaneously a decrease in the value of college. It led to degree inflation, such that more and more employers started saying, well, why should I bother interviewing someone who didn't go to college when there's scads of college graduates, which of course further fueled the rise of college credentialism. It was a terrible decision. One of the worst blunders the country has ever made. If you go back to the days before federal student aid, students would pay more attention in high school. They learned more in high school. They could find jobs, and they weren't screened out by college credentialitis. We had no shortage of great architects and engineers and scientists. Many of them didn't go to college, though. They learned what they needed to learn to do their fields without going to college. College is now an expensive necessity, so to speak, only because the government has been subsidizing it. So if we could somehow back away from government subsidizing and get back to the days when people would either save or borrow or scrimp or whatever they had to do to find the funding for college, for one thing, it would cost a whole lot less than it does now. And they would be much more inclined to use their money wisely. We'd be far, far better off. If we could ever escape from this mistake of federal financing, we should take that opportunity.
The
Go ahead, Andrew.
For subsidizing colleges has also taken a big hit lately. For these externality reasons. So you can think about like three different types of externalities. So the first are sort of the classic thing, like I learned some new technique that I then share with my coworkers. The evidence for that is very, very unconvincing. And so these externalities, if they exist, they're small. They're basically the evidence is pointing that they're very small but positive. So that's not going to justify, thousands of dollars in subsidies per student. It might justify a couple hundred. And so the kind of classic externality case is a lot weaker than we realized, 10, 20 years ago. The other one that you mentioned was kind of the civic and cultural externality. So this is you're going to be a good citizen. You're going to be a more informed kind of participant in society. I mean, if you look at a lot of college graduates now, they want to burn it all down. And so there's an argument that the civic and cultural externalities are actually negative for a lot of higher education at this point. And then that leaves the research externalities. So these are probably substantial and positive, but these are concentrated among like the top tier rocket scientists, right? Like this isn't an excuse to subsidize education for everybody. It's basically an excuse to identify your Thomas Edisons, your Albert Einsteins, and kind of make sure they have as smooth a path as they can to make their discoveries, because society will then benefit from those. So this is a very different understanding, and this understanding of these different externalities has only really become clear to me in the past 5-10 years. And so 20 years ago, it was enough to say, oh, higher education has externalities, we should subsidize it. That case is very much weaker these days than it was before. So if we are going to subsidize it, 2 points. Student loans are a terrible way to subsidize education because number one, you're only subsidizing the students who take out the loans, and you're providing a different subsidy based on how much they borrow. So this is a really bad way to. So even assuming we want to subsidize higher education, you do not do it through the student loan system. Student loans should be budget neutral for the government if they're lending, but moreover, we should get the government out of student lending. The main problems that having the government be the lender are making themselves evident. The government can't cut off programs from access to these loans, even if the students have predictably terrible outcomes and default on their student loans. The government will just keep making loans to the next set of lemmings year after year after year. A private lender wouldn't do that. So a private lender would identify poorly performing programs or poorly performing students and charge a much higher risk premium, which would discourage these programs from existing and students from enrolling in them. So I really do think that regarding subsidization, the case is much weaker than it used to be. Loans shouldn't be used to subsidize, and the government shouldn't be in the business of making loans at all.
Otherwise, they're okay.
Yeah. Other than that, I wouldn't change anything.
No. Yeah. To that point, private individuals give scholarships to help poor people or people who are disadvantaged in some way go to college. And it seems to me that nearly all of those have a performance criteria associated with them. You mentioned this, Andrew, but only in passing. I would add this as an added factor. Why can't we have, if we are going to have federal involvement in it, at least have standards that a student who takes 6 years to go to college, today, at the moment, a student that takes 6 years to go to college, say on a Pell Grant, we won't even talk about loans, let's talk about Pell Grants, and they take 6 years rather than 4 years, they get 6 years of financial support probably. If another student gets through their bachelor's degree in 3 years because they work hard, they take extra courses, they get all A's, etc., they get less federal money than the kid that takes 6 years. The kids who are performing less well get more support. The federal government implicitly subsidizes mediocrity, and that's almost a secondary point, in relation to your arguments, Andrew. But I think it's relevant that we just don't recognize excellence or support excellence. We condemn excellence in higher ed. So that's my thoughts. And I know George is with me because George always agrees with me.
Well, that and in this case, once again, you're right, Rich.
Well, yeah, we could belabor the student loan issue further, but I had a couple other items I wanted to ask about, and one of them relates to this externality argument, subsidy argument. Is there might be one place where federal support of universities makes sense. At least I think you could make an argument. I'm not necessarily making this argument. And that is, what about research? Most of our discussions have implicitly assumed that the role of a university is to educate students, which it is, of course. But the universities, the modern research universities, built on the German model or the Johns Hopkins model, also engage in a lot of research activities. And should governments subsidize this kind of activity? They do all over the world. There's a new study out. It's not a study, it's a rankings. It's just a rankings by Times Higher Education, which is a British-based institution that, in picking the best universities of the world, suspiciously always comes up with Oxford #1 and the top 10. And in fact, 3 of the top 10 in this year are British universities. And the British universities are uniformly highly represented. But putting that little statement aside, even when the Chinese rank universities, Oxford is pretty darn high, and Cambridge. And 7 of the current top 10, and the newest list came out a couple days ago, are American. So Americans still dominate the list of the best universities in the world. And these rankings are based very heavily on research. There's very little about what the students think about their learning, which when I used to do rankings for Forbes, or when U.S. News does rankings, they take into account student inputs. How much did the students learn? They put very little emphasis on research, not zero, but less emphasis. But anyway, these new rankings have shown that since 2018, the number of the top 100 universities in the world that are American has fallen dramatically. I think from 46 to 33, or maybe it was 50 to 33. More than a dozen ranks fall. There's been a rise in Chinese schools. There's some rise in Australian schools and in other schools in Asia. Indian schools are starting to show up on the list and so forth. And has America, are we falling behind in supporting research in this country? I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that. I know the answer to everything else in the world. I am a genius on everything. I don't know the answer to this one. So I'd be interested in what you guys think.
Rich, I've been waiting for you to get to this topic ever since we started this morning.
Of course, George.
And here's why I've been waiting. In today's Wall Street Journal.
I haven't read it yet, so yeah.
I've got it right here. Here's the article by Lawrence Krauss, a well-known physicist.
Yeah.
The title is, "Now Even Science Grants Must Bow to Equity and Inclusion." This, I think, is part of the problem. The woke cabal has now taken over the funding of science. In the federal government, you have to go through all these hoops to make sure that your project is diverse enough and inclusive enough. Here's part of what Krauss writes. Starting in fiscal 2023, which began October 1st, every proposal responding to a solicitation from the Office of Science is required to include a PIER plan, which stands for Promoting Inclusive and Equitable Research, to, quote, describe the activities and strategies of the applicant to promote equity and inclusion as an intrinsic element to advancing scientific excellence. In the words of the announcement, the complexity and detail of a PIER plan is expected to increase with the size of the research team and the number of personnel to be supported. Krauss continues. When I read this new requirement, I went back to the last grant proposal from our group, which involved exploring gravitational waves, the early universe, Higgs boson physics, neutrino cosmology, dark matter detection, supersymmetry, and black hole physics. What does any of this have to do with diversity and inclusion? Nothing. So I'm not surprised to hear that U.S. universities are declining with respect to research, and I think it's the heavy hand of the left wing bureaucrats intruding on the nature of scientific investigation, imposing their demands on what scientists would otherwise just say, this has nothing to do with me. This is a waste of my time. This is irrelevant. We now also know that many of these grants, they insist that the research teams be inclusive. So you can't just have the researchers you really want. You've got to go find some researchers you don't really want to have necessarily, but simply to check off the diversity boxes. Thus, I'm not at all surprised to hear that American research is in decline. I think this is part of it.
Well, that's a very good point, George. And although that I think you're absolutely right. I was, and I'm, I guess, guilty of falling into the trap of thinking the quality of research is positively associated with the amount of resources that are devoted to it. One would hope that there would be some association between the amount of money you spend on research and the quality of the research. But if in fact we're doing what you say, and I believe we are, I mean, it's fact. I mean, it's a reality. If this is becoming a growing reality in the sciences, then we're falling apart. The Chinese don't do this.
No.
The Indians don't do this.
Nope. Furthermore, one further point. American scholars, academics, are now really constrained on the kinds of things they're allowed to investigate. If anything raises the hackles of the woke crowd, if you suggest anything dealing with racial groups, for example, all that kind of research is out. There are lots and lots of questions that scholars just don't dare to broach these days because they're too politically sensitive. So they steer away from them. That's also, I think, part of the explanation for why American research is in decline. The researchers are afraid of treading upon, getting on thin ice because they've said something that's politically incorrect.
I think you're right. But let me offer not an alternative explanation, another explanation that may have. And this one may sound awfully wokish to you, George. It may sound like Rich Vedder is turning, that he's becoming some sort of lefty. My grandfather, by the way, was chair of the Democratic Party in the state of Michigan. So I have impeccable left-wing credentials. And you live next door, your family, George, in the state of Wisconsin, if I recall.
Mm-hmm.
So we both live in these northern Midwestern states. Anyway, putting our family backgrounds aside, it is true that Americans are devoting a smaller proportion of their resources to planning for the future, making the future good for our children. We are we don't care about our children. We care about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to make this argument. I'm overstating it a bit. We don't care. Look at it in terms of the federal budget deficit. We used to say every year we should balance our budget if it's a good year and maybe even run a little bit of a surplus, reduce the national debt. We should keep the national debt as a small proportion of our output to protect the nation, give us the ability to act in emergencies if we have to in wartime or whatnot. That was the way we were. That was America 100 years ago. Before the Keynesian Revolution in the 1930s. And even in the 1940s or 50s or 60s or 70s, we did run more budget deficits and so forth. but the debt as a percentage of our national output was 50% or else. Now the gross national debt is 31 trillion. The GDP is a little under 25. We have a debt 125% of GDP. Never been this high. Even in 1945, it was a little lower than that. Now there's some problems with those statistics. You can quibble about whether we should look at the gross debt or the net debt, and so forth. But the point is, we as a nation are living beyond our means more than ever. We have an enormous deficit in the Social Security Fund. The Social Security checks are going up 8% because of the inflation, by the way. That's aggravating an already serious problem. What's the next generation going to do about that? What are they going to do about health care, Medicaid? Some measure the unfunded federal liabilities at $100 trillion or more. I mean, this is real money, even in America. So we are a nation that is neglecting the future. Part of the future is research. Part of the future, we invest in machines and tools. We invest in productive ideas. I'm thinking mainly in the sciences, of course, not in sociology or gender studies and that sort of thing, but I'm thinking in the sciences. We as a nation, even the federal government's budget, that the proportion going for that is declined. Proportion going for defense is declined. We're putting less emphasis on protecting us and on our future than on serving some present need du jour. So I was going to make that argument, and I think there's some truth to that argument. But you added a second argument, and Andrew hasn't said anything because
so no, I think I actually like what both of you said, because Rich, I think you're right. I think there's enough reasonable evidence out there that kind of research spending is good. But George's point that universities are perverting that spending, and they're basically like distorting it's not pure research anymore. Like you can't do research on certain topics anymore because it would threaten the narrative. And so I think both of those points are completely accurate. And the solution to me is, okay, fund research, but no reason that has to go to the universities, right?
That's a good point. One strength America has are alternatives to university research.
Mm-hmm.
And Andrew actually made the point, and I should point out, Andrew works for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a private, I consider a research organization. Some of the best research I've ever done was partly funded by TPPF, a very fine organization. George works for the James Martin Center, a privately funded center that is doing wonderful things in the higher education space. Absolutely fantastic stuff. I am a senior fellow at something called the Independent Institute that you folks have had some positive associations with as well. And with AEI and even the Brookings Institution. All of these privately funded research think tanks, as we call them, are maybe more important now to America in the research space than the universities. I'm throwing that out. That's the one bright spot I actually see in the whole research space right now, are the private research institutions that are alternatives to these government subsidized woke. To pick up on George's point about wokeness, I don't think the Texas. I shouldn't speak for the Texas. I won't speak for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but I don't think promoting diversity and inclusion is a large part of their agenda. Nor is it at the James Martin Center, nor is it at, well, I ran a Center for College Affordability and Productivity, which Andrew worked at for a while. And We weren't thinking about these kinds of things, diversity, inclusion. We're just looking at facts, evidence, and the evidence might. And if you're a left winger, you want to have a left wing foundation to do that. Fine, it's fine with me. The Brookings Institution did some stuff that I disagreed with, but it's good to have those people around. And some of them even learned something along the way. Beth Akers went from Brookings to AAI. That's progress. But anyway,
I would say that we need a separation of research and state. Keep government out of research.
Yeah, that's a good point, George. I think you could make that case. Let me just bring up one topic I was going to talk about. Well, we will talk about for a few minutes. I don't want to keep you too long. At my age, every hour and a half or two, I have to. Necessity forces me to go to the bathroom. So when we started this series, it was Rory Sauter, who I love, who gave me the idea of doing this, said, well, let's have a 3-hour show, maybe. And I said, Rory, 3 hours? My God, I can't sit still for 3 hours. That's not a possibility. That is beyond the physical limitations that I have. 2 is pushing it, and so we won't go quite 2 hours. But there was something I read in the paper a few days ago, or in Inside Higher Ed or Chronicle Higher Ed, one of the news sources on higher education, that said that we are hoping to get the FAFSA form simplified in the next year or two, but it's a very complex process, and it is really hard to do this. And I just broke out laughing. I just thought it was so funny, because I went to a meeting at the U.S. Department of Education, chaired by the Secretary of Education, in, I think it was 2007. 2007. The secretary then was Margaret Spellings, a person that I have had a long love-hate relationship with. And George and I once debated on national TV on PBS. We were on a primetime debate. It was prime time.
It was awesome. It was awesome.
It was awesome. We beat the hell out of them too,
we
George.
Did. They slung off.
Margaret just didn't have the intellectual capability of putting up with us.
Nope.
But anyway, so anyway, we had these problems with that evolved on over the years on the FAFSA form. In 2007, I go to this meeting. Who's sitting there? The Secretary of Education. Some of the biggest fine names in higher ed research. Andrew Mayer, Sue Donarski at the University of Michigan was there, for example. Sue and I, who politically differ, but we pretty much agreed on this thing. It's just sort of factual. We don't need all those 130 questions. Sue had the temerity to ask, why do we need questions? Most people have to fill out income tax returns anyway. The income tax return gives us a pretty significant amount of financial information about people. How much incremental information do you get from the question about how much alimony did your great-grandmother pay 40 years ago? That question isn't on there, but questions that were pretty obscure. And we took the FAFSA form, and in the course of 3 hours, we more or less agreed on how to get rid of 80 out of the questions, and committees are horrible at making decisions. And usually it takes one person or a group of 2 or 3 like-minded people to make decisions. We, in the course of a morning, figured it could be done, but it wasn't done. It wasn't done under President Bush, who was president at the time. It wasn't done under President Obama. It wasn't done under President Trump. He worked hard at it, and Betsy DeVos, who I thought was the best of the modern education secretaries, worked on it, but it didn't happen. It hasn't happened under what's his name, Biden. Is it ever going to happen? Well, Congress finally mandated that it happen. Well, we'll make it happen. That was a year and a half ago. What's happened? Nothing.
Well, you can't mandate that these bureaucrats do anything. You can't fire them. They have no incentives to do a good job or even any job if they don't feel like it. And I guess they don't feel like it.
George, this brings me to my modest, rather radical proposal. I would like to involve the U.S. military in solving this problem. I propose that we have a strategic bombing initiative using the most modern techniques. The strategic bombing might involve drones and might involve the kind of weaponry that we've talked about using in Ukraine. And we, in the interest of humanity and fairness, say that the building on Maryland Avenue in Washington, D.C., occupied by the U.S. Department of Education, shall be not occupied on a certain Saturday of someone's picking, and that we just bomb the hell out of the building, put it out of existence, and that we donate the land to the Smithsonian Institution located right across the street for maybe an extension of the Air and Space Museum or something.
Let's get it back to some Indian tribe. Really, let's give it back to an Indian tribe. It's probably their land to begin with anyway. Universities are now always insisting that we have these land acknowledgments. Let's just give it back to some Indian tribe.
Okay. Well, anyway, that's my great idea. And
so the thing that really is baffling about this is that these initiatives can move quickly when people want them to. So the work that's going into making the student loan forgiveness a done deal is we're talking months, weeks and months that they're trying to implement this. FAFSA simplification, which we've been, as you said, going for decades. They'll get around to it maybe next year, if not the year after that. So to me, this is really indicative of kind of misplaced priorities. Not every student, but the vast majority of students who go to college encounter the FAFSA. So any small improvements you can make to that will have an outsized impact, and that doesn't even register in terms of the priorities in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of people that believe that even with a frenetic effort, we won't succeed in this. You know, we did succeed with Operation Warp Speed on the vaccines, largely because we, in effect, bribed private companies to do it. It was private companies that brought those vaccines on the market. It wasn't the federal government. And you know, we did get a vaccine out, and we told the FDA that it couldn't be as bureaucratic as it normally would be, and other federal agencies, the disease control folks, the CDC people, and so on. So maybe we'll make some progress there. The one there was one more topic that I said we would talk about today. Let's just briefly bring it up because I know I'll get George excited again. George hasn't been excited for the better part of 5 minutes, and that is the whole issue relating to Title IX. and the rules relating to just sexual harassment and so forth in colleges. And in 2011, the Obama administration issued a Dear Colleague level letter that took on the force of a law, even though it wasn't a law. And the legality of that it was another one I suspect could be severely questioned. But anyway, this fatwa, or whatever you call it, this edict from the Obama administration went out that was interpreted as, in effect, putting in new sets of standards with regard to Title IX disciplinary matters of individual colleges. Quite apart from the content of that, the appropriateness of a federal agency telling state and local in educational institutions what to do, including by implication private institutions. To me, it was profoundly unsettling that this was an example of an extreme example of the federal government trying to centralize the process of decision making in higher ed, and taking away the prerogatives of individual institutions. Except there were a few offbeat colleges like Hillsdale College that told the federal government to go to hell. We don't want your money. We don't want our students to take your money. We're not going to give you any information. And legally, they were all able to do that. But the allure of the dollar has brought nearly every other institution online. So the federal government bribed institutions into a situation where they, in effect, have abdicated power to their turned over power to the federal government to regulate them. Things like Title IX, and also to more or less ignore 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence going back at least to the Magna Carta. I'm not much of an expert on things before 1215. I'm not even too much of an expert on 1215. But in 1215, they had, let's make a deal in the Magna Carta, and a whole host of things since then. And Title IX gets a heck with it. You can't have a representative president hearings. You can't. The jury and the judge will be the same, and the investigator or the prosecutor will all be one person in some cases. All sorts of just absolute star chamber forms of persecution of people. And we thought then, Betsy DeVos comes in, she says, this went way too far. We're going to back off this. Whether, George, you know more about it than I do, but we backed off this some. But now Biden has come back in and saying, oh, no, we're going back to 2011. In fact, we're going more than that, because we didn't have transgender issues then. Now we have transgender. We used to think there were two sexes. Now we are like people. We're smarter than we were 10 years ago. And we realize that there are multiple sexes and genders, that you're whatever you think you are. So am I wrong in raising this? I mean, is this a real issue? I mean, is it anything to worry about?
Yes, it is something to worry about. The left wing wants this narrative that we have to have government rules to protect everybody, every place, all the time. And since so many young Americans go to college, we have to have rules to protect them. And the narrative is that college is a dangerous place, and we've just got to have all these federal rules to make sure that the supposed epidemic of assault is dealt with severely. The Democrats raised that way back in 2011. That was their motive, to come up with a good issue. They knew Obama wasn't all that popular, and so they needed some side issues to generate enthusiasm. And this was one of them, that the college was unsafe for women. So they came up with these diktats. And now Biden wants them back because he thinks it'll be politically popular, just like he thinks that canceling student loans will be politically popular. And these rules do undermine due process of law, which was reinvigorated under DeVos, but now they want to go back to the old days, the Star Chamber, the one person who's the judge, jury, executioner. They like that because they think it plays well politically. It's going to lead to a whole lot of lawsuits. The original stuff led to a lot of lawsuits. A lot of schools have paid out a lot of money because they unjustly punished young men who had not done anything that deserved punishment. They kicked them out of school, and now they have had to pay a lot of judgments. That doesn't matter to Biden, though. The Democrats want to make sure that they have their issues working for them, and this is one of them. So we're taking a step backward toward the days of the Star Chamber.
Yeah. Andrew, you have any thoughts? No.
No. I think George covered it well.
Yeah. I knew this was a question that when I wrote it down, I said, George will jump all over this one. And he did. We've had a great discussion today. And I guess we'll end with each of you might want to some summary thoughts, but it occurred to me that higher ed has lost its way in America, that we're going in the wrong direction. We're getting off on getting away from first principles. Are we interested in learning about the way the world works, the way the world operates? Are we teaching students knowledge that will make them better adults and better citizens? Are we expanding the frontiers of knowledge? That's the research dimension, the standard things. And are we helping people, the medical schools that we have with universities? Are they truly helping people or not? And I really wonder whether universities are doing their job anymore. And public support of universities is plummeting. I mean, the data show this. Colleges, university presidents say, "Oh, the legislatures aren't giving us as much money as they should," and they've always said that, but they're more stridently saying this now. But I think the governors are behaving rationally, and the politicians are behaving rationally. The colleges are not doing their job the way it was envisioned initially, and so. Am I right? And if so, are the colleges killing themselves? Are they committing suicide, political suicide, in part? And what will that mean for higher ed 10, 20 years from now?
Well, I'd say I'd agree. They are not doing their job, and the blame rests entirely upon politics. They started taking government money, and now they are subject to political concerns rather than educational concerns. Today's college presidents are not so much academicians, they are fundraisers and administrators, and most of them are imbued with this left-wing woke ideology. They can't say no to anything that the leftists want on campus, and that's why the curriculum is going crazy. That's why we admit so many students who really aren't much interested in learning so much as just getting some empty credential. It's all the malign influence of federal money that has undermined college education.
Andrew.
Yeah, I share a lot of these concerns about kind of the current state and the trajectory of higher education. And what's really depressing to me is that, okay, even if you get everybody to agree, okay, yes, this is bad and it's getting worse. The solutions are very, very difficult in higher education because you've got a couple of things. So you've got one, the faculty are essentially cloning themselves. So they control the hiring process for new faculty. So they can basically keep this going for as long as the government's funding it. At the same time, you got shared governance, so those same faculty can then veto a lot of reform efforts outside. So I'm usually not very pessimistic, but when it comes to higher education reform, I'm pretty pessimistic because of those two issues.
I agree with you. There's some interesting efforts moving forward that are kind of interesting, new attempts. What about creating new universities just on a different model? The University of Austin has been proposed, for example. So it's an interesting idea. It proposes to change the rules of the game somewhat, have a different sort of model, be still a university, still offering degrees, presumably at some point, but without none of this wokeness and other maladies that George mentioned earlier. So maybe there's some hope there, but like you, Andrew, I'm not too optimistic about educational entrepreneurship as the system now stands, being very successful in changing the model very much in the next decade or so. But maybe we're both wrong, or all three of us are wrong. Economists, of course, are never wrong, Andrew. We get everything right. Remember, Thomas Malthus in 1798 said the world is going to hell. Everyone's going to live in subsistence because people reproduce too damn much, and they didn't know about. Oh, anyway, I'm getting too far afield. Gentlemen, this has been fun.
Was fun. Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Did you?
Yeah.
If I ask you back again, not every day or even every week, I hope maybe I could convince you to come back again someday.
For sure.
I found this very interesting. I'm supposedly when I agreed to do this, I agree I would talk about different topics, politics, economics, so on. But this is something we all know a little bit about, and I want to disproportionately talk about educational issues. And I want to thank both of you for participating. I also want to thank my unsung hero, who isn't even on camera. Come over here, damn it. This is a student of mine. He's all of 18 years old, but he is in the honors tutorial program at Ohio University. He is bright. He is hardworking. And he wears the same smelly T-shirt every time. But other than that, which means he's a fairly typical U.S. college student these days. And Elliot Winkler, who's been a great help to me. And so I thank both of you and Elliot for your help. And I think we'll call it a quits for today. Thank you for joining the Richard Vedder Show.
All right. So click on Main Street. Yeah, there you go. And then click OK.